The debate among transgender athletes is reaching a boiling point across the country. Last week, Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds signed into law a bill that bans transgender women and girls from participating in women's sports offered in Iowa's schools, colleges, and universities.
According to the Des Moines Register, media.com Iowa poll, 46% of Iowans favor the law, while 45% oppose it, and another 9% say they are not sure. Similar types of legislation being proposed across the country in states like South Carolina, Indiana, Utah, and more.
The issue is also emanating into law school discussions. Most recently, Duke University law professor Kathleen Stock caused uproar with an essay in which she argues, quote, "Though it is normally polite and desirable to observe the preferred descriptors and pronouns of trans people in interpersonal contexts, there are times when literal and accurate reference to actual sex is important," unquote, citing medical settings, prisons, and sports teams. Here with us to discuss is co-host of Blocked and Reported and author of The Quick Fix, Jesse Singal, and co-founder of Outsports, Cyd Zeigler. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Morning.
And so, Cyd, what did you make of the Iowa law that's being pushed by the governor there?
Well, the transgender athlete debate has been dominated a lot by some people who want unfettered access for transgender women to women's sports and people who want to ban them altogether. I'm somewhere in between. I think that trans girls and trans women can have access to sports, but that there should be smart, thoughtful, science-based transition requirements. So I'm not for banning girls from girls' sports, whether they're trans girls or cis girls, but I think there are better ways to address this.
Jesse, you and I guess, travel in some similar professional circles. We have conversations about issues, controversial issues like this one. These are often conversations that prompt a lot of, I would say, kind of heated response from activists on behalf of the transgender community, not most trans people themselves, but a certain number of kind of very social justice-y activists who on this issue will permit no debate and no discussion. And what happened to Kathleen Stock is a good indication. And I know they've really come after you for writing about this subject with a level of nuance. So you know, what are your thoughts at this point, and share a little bit about, you know, what you've seen in trying to actually even just take the position that Cyd just did. That is not enough for a lot of the people I've had interactions with, and I know that you've had interactions with.
Yeah, I think there's an unfortunate siege mentality that has set in on both sides. I'm with Cyd that I don't think states should be legislating this from a top, and there's much worse and more damaging laws that have been passed banning access to youth transition. The situation in Texas is genuinely terrible. I think these are complicated discussions, and there needs to be open debate. I think there often isn't open debate, and Kathleen Stock is a good example of someone who laid out in a basically a law review article, a position that I think most people hold, which is that we should respect trans people's identities, but there are probably certain settings where biological sex should prevail. And for that, she's sort of become a pariah among philosophers. She felt she couldn't continue at her university in the UK because of the harassment she received there. So I'm just, my stance is not controversial. I think we need to be able to discuss this stuff. And unfortunately, it's hard to do so both if your career can be ruined for saying the wrong thing and if you literally have right-wing state legislators really trying to interfere with this issue and interfere with the discussion in their own way.
So I'm just curious, what would you say is the cutoff? So if you were to, because I'm with you on this, I actually don't think this should be legislated by the state. I think this should be a case-by-case basis. Everybody's different. Everybody's bodies are different, I suppose, in their transitions, perhaps. And so, what would you say if there was an athlete wanting to compete? What would be the cutoff for you?
Well, so look at youth sports. 5, 6, 7-year-olds are playing together, girls and boys. You know, I'm a football referee, and when I referee youth flag football, it's boys and girls together. At some point around the time of puberty, society has agreed that there should be a division between male and female sports. And that's when you start to see real divisions, for example, in track and field or swimming times, where male athletes start to separate themselves from female athletes, particularly at the higher levels. So I think it's a combination of age, where you have to start mitigating the effects of puberty. And you also have to take into account, are we talking about recreational sports, competitive sports? Recreational sports, I mean, if a school wants to have trans women on intramural women's teams, I don't care what they do. The recreational sports are just for recreation. We're talking about competitive sports. And I think that's the focus of a lot of these bills and a lot of these conversations. And I do think, believe it or not, there are far more trans women even who agree with this, that there has to be some kind of transition requirement for competitive sports. And again, the conversation gets hijacked by a handful of very loud voices.
Yeah, and Cyd, as somebody who covers this sport so closely, how is this debate shaping up kind of on the ground, in locker rooms, among teams, among parents of players, versus how it's playing out on, say, Twitter or in universities? Are you seeing a gap between that?
I think it depends. When you look at the University of Pennsylvania women's swimming team, by all reports, and I've talked to one of the women on the team, most of the team doesn't think that Leah should be on the team. And then there are some teammates who don't care, and then there are some teammates who really are happy that she's there. And then when I talk to other teams with trans women on them, they welcome the woman. So I think it really is a sport by sport, team by team. When you talk about individual sports, the couple of trans girls in Connecticut, high school, track and field, Leah Thomas in swimming. I think when you talk about individual sports, that's where you really start to see people get upset, because there's real measurable times and distances that you're talking about. And if somebody's the best player on a team, they're the best player on a team. But if they're the fastest, they're the fastest. And in a lot of people's minds, I think there is a difference.
Well, but even at the high school level, right? The difference in athletic ability, from like 9th grade on is so stark between biological men and women. And I don't know that I'm satisfied with it's not as competitive or it's intramural. I think people on a sports team want to win. I mean, you're there to have fun, but they want to win. And a lot of the track, swimming, wrestling, I mean, all of these sports are massive differences between the two sexes. So, Jesse, I agree that I think trying to legislate virtually anything is a fraud concept, and this is especially fraught. So, we can if we take the idea of state action off the table, sure, fine, I get that, but I don't begrudge, but they're public schools. I mean, they are state, managed to some degree. So I sympathize with all the officials trying to arrive at something that's going to make everyone happy, and obviously they're not going to be able to do that. But at the end of the day, I am moved by the kind of unfairness there is in these girls' sports, even at the high school level. To bring in someone who is biologically male, look, they're going to wipe the floor with the rest of the team in a lot of situations, not just at the level of Leah Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to the fairness concerns too. I just think the problem with a lot of these state laws are just sort of two blunt instruments, and there's a huge difference between someone who hasn't transitioned at all and someone for who example goes on puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones. In that case, the difference might be almost nil. I think part of the problem is if the sort of mainstream activist line had been what Cyd has been saying all along, this wouldn't be such a white-hot debate. But the position of a lot of mainstream progressive organizations has been people are who they say they are, full stop, and there can't be any debate on this. I mean, that's basically how the ACLU has come out, and I think that was a mistake, because everyone knows there's going to have to be some degree of compromise here, as Cyd is saying.
And if I could just jump in, Jesse's right. He named the ACLU. Athlete Allies, another organization. There are several organizations that do believe that there should be no transition requirements. But there are a lot of organizations and leaders in the LGBTQ sports world who do think that there should be transition requirements. And like I said earlier, our voices are getting lost in this screaming match between the other two sides.
Yeah, and it feels like for people who are not necessarily involved in this argument, that's something that they should listen to, because there's some recent polling shows that it's possible that the kind of public attitudes around this question are seeping into trans rights more generally. So, research from Gallup shows 62% of respondents say trans athletes should only be allowed to play on sports teams that correspond with their birth gender, while 34% say they should be able to play on teams that match their gender identity. And we need to just finish that, Kim. So, yeah. But on the issue of openly transgender service members, a majority of the public continues to favor allowing openly transgender men and women to serve in the U.S. military at 66%, though this is down from Gallup's previous measure in 2019, when 71% were in favor. So you're seeing, kind of for the first time in our lives, an erosion of support for LGBT rights. Just to move backwards when it comes to people saying that, yes, transgender people should be allowed to serve in the military, I think should be disturbing for advocates of that movement. And I'm wondering, Cyd or Jesse, either of you, if you think it might have something to do with the right's ability to really elevate this, the Leah Thomas issue becoming so central, to kind of the right-wing pushback against it, while not being talked about at all on the Democratic side.
I think there's been a marked shift, maybe in the last 5 years, from really human stories of people losing their jobs or losing housing for being trans, which is a very unpopular thing to do, to a slightly more militant understanding of this stuff that doesn't really brook any disagreement. And I don't think, if you're pro-LGBT rights, you shouldn't want anyone's introduction to this issue to be a group like the ACLU arguing that people should be able to compete as women even if they haven't transitioned at all. It just seems politically suicidal, and I think all the polling bears that out. The polling also bears out that people are against bathroom bills, people are in favor of anti-discrimination statutes. So just, which hill are you going to fight and potentially die on? It seems like an easy call to me.
One of the interesting parts of that poll, and I always say that this issue is not a left versus right issue, because I know people who are conservative, who are largely in favor of trans athletes competing as their gender, and I know a number of liberal Democrats who are fiercely against it. And this cuts, it's just not as easy as Republican, Democrat, left and right. And I think, frankly, that's one of the reasons that the Republicans have seized on it. They see this athlete issue as something that can garner support across ideologies. And I think that's one of the reasons that you're seeing these unfortunate bans.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.